June 6, 1944, 9:59 p.m., Subutu Passage, Philippine Sea. The moonlight was a death sentence. Commander Samuel Dealey stood in the conning tower of the USS Harder, watching a Japanese destroyer race toward him at 35 knots. Its bow cut through the water like a blade, white foam spraying in the darkness. Behind it, another destroyer followed in formation. Both ships had spotted the American submarine. Both were closing fast. In the control room below, 78 men held their breath. The sonar operator's voice cracked through the intercom. Range 2,000 yards and closing. Sir, they're coming right at us. Dealey's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Lynch, climbed up to the bridge. His face was pale. Captain, we need to dive. Now, they've got us dead to rights. Dealey didn't move. He kept his binoculars pressed to his eyes, tracking the lead destroyer. The moonlight illuminated everything. The Harder's silhouette on the surface, the churning wake behind the submarine, the Japanese ships bearing down like wolves. Sir, Lynch said again, his voice tight, if we don't dive, we're dead. Dealey lowered his binoculars. His expression was calm, almost serene. We're not diving, he said quietly. We're attacking. The words hung in the tropical air like a death warrant. What he was proposing wasn't just dangerous. It was suicidal. Submarines didn't attack destroyers. It was the fundamental rule of undersea warfare. Destroyers hunted submarines. They had speed, they had depth charges, they had guns. A submarine's only defense against a destroyer was to run, to dive deep and prey. But Samuel Dealey had never played by the rules. Load all forward tubes, he ordered. We're going down their throat. If you're new to this channel and you love incredible stories of courage and sacrifice from history's greatest battles, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a video. And if this story moves you, leave a like. It really helps us bring more of these forgotten heroes back to life. Now, to understand why Dealey was about to attempt something that defied every principle of submarine warfare, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a young man from Dallas, Texas, who almost never made it into the Navy at all. Samuel David Dealey was born on September 13, 1906, into one of the most prominent families in Texas. His uncle, George Dealey, was the publisher of the Dallas Morning News and a titan of Texas journalism. The plaza that would later become infamous in American history, Dealey Plaza, bears his family's name. But Sam Dealey wasn't interested in newspapers or family legacy. From the moment he could read, he devoured stories of naval battles and sea adventures. By the time he was 16, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to command a submarine. There was just one problem. Sam Dealey was, by his own admission, not much of a student. When he entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1926, his academic record was mediocre at best. Within months, he was struggling. And then, at the end of his first semester, came the devastating news. He had flunked out. The letters he received from his family during that period have been lost to history. But we can imagine the shame, the disappointment, the crushing weight of failure. Most young men in his position would have given up, moved on to something else, accepted that the sea was not their destiny. Sam Dealey refused. He appealed his expulsion, arguing for a second chance. He studied relentlessly, determined to prove that his failure was a temporary setback, not a permanent verdict. And somehow, against all odds, the Academy granted his request. He was reinstated. This time, Dealey didn't just pass, he transformed himself. He graduated with the class of 1930, and though his grades weren't stellar, something else had emerged during those difficult years. A determination, a stubbornness, a refusal to accept defeat that would define his entire career. For the next decade, Dealey served aboard battleships, destroyers, and finally submarines. He learned the craft slowly, methodically, absorbing everything he could about underwater warfare. He married a woman named Edwina, had children, built a quiet life. To his neighbors in various naval bases around the country, he seemed like a typical career officer, competent, professional, unremarkable. But then December 7th, 1941, changed everything. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Dealey was commanding an old S-class submarine called the S-20. It was a training vessel, outdated and unsuited for combat. For 2 years, while the war raged across the Pacific, Dealey chafed at his assignment. He watched younger officers take command of newer submarines and sail off to fight. He submitted request after request for combat posting. Finally, in December 1942, his prayers were answered. He was given command of a brand new Gatto-class submarine, fresh from the shipyards of Groton, Connecticut. Her name was the USS Harder. But what Dealey didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the Harder would become one of the most legendary submarines in naval history. And he would become a legend himself, earning a nickname that would strike fear into the hearts of Japanese sailors across the Pacific. The Destroyer Killer. The Harder's first war patrol began in June 1943, and it was a disaster. But first, we need to understand the submarine Dealey would command. The USS Harder was a Gato-class submarine, one of the most advanced underwater vessels in the world at that time. She measured 301 feet long, displaced over 1,500 tons on the surface, and could dive to depths of over 300 feet. Her 4 diesel engines could push her to 21 knots on the surface, while her electric motors gave her about 9 knots underwater. She carried 24 torpedoes, the Mark 14, a weapon that would prove both formidable and frustratingly unreliable. In the early days of the war, American torpedoes suffered from multiple defects. They ran too deep, their magnetic detonators failed, and their contact exploders often crushed on impact rather than triggering. These problems would cost American submariners dearly, causing countless attacks to fail even when the torpedoes hit their targets. By the time Dealey took command, the worst of the torpedo problems had been identified, though not entirely solved. He would have to work with imperfect weapons, trusting his skill and timing to compensate for technology that sometimes betrayed him. The Harder's crew numbered 78 enlisted men and officers. They came from every corner of America: farm boys from the Midwest, factory workers from the industrial cities, fishermen from the coastal towns. Some had volunteered for submarine duty for the extra pay. Others were drawn by the elite reputation of the submarine force. All of them would come to depend on each other and on their captain for their very survival. Dealey took his new submarine to the waters off Japan's home islands, stalking enemy convoys in some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. On the night of June 21st, he spotted a 2-ship convoy and moved in for the kill. But an aggressive Japanese escort detected the Harder and attacked. What happened next nearly ended Dealey's career before it truly began. Forced to dive deep to escape depth charges, the Harder plunged toward the ocean floor. The depth gauge spun wildly, 200 feet, 300 feet, 400 feet. And then, with a sickening crunch, the submarine hit bottom. The Harder had crashed into the muddy seafloor, her bow buried in sediment. Alarms screamed, men scrambled. The hull groaned under the pressure. For agonizing minutes, the crew worked frantically to free the submarine, reversing propellers, blowing ballast tanks, rocking the boat back and forth. Finally, with one last shudder, the Harder pulled free and rose toward the surface. Dealey was shaken but not broken. He continued the patrol, eventually torpedoing a Japanese seaplane tender called the Sagara Maru. The damage was so severe that the Japanese had to beach the vessel on their own coastline and abandon it as a total loss. It wasn't the triumphant debut Dealey had envisioned, but it was a start. And buried within that inauspicious beginning was a seed, a tactical insight that would eventually change everything. During the attack on the convoy, Dealey had noticed something. When the Japanese destroyer came charging at the Harder, there was a brief window, just a few seconds, when the destroyer was heading straight at the submarine. During that moment, the destroyer's sonar couldn't track the submarine effectively. The sound waves bounced off at strange angles. The target was almost impossible to hit with depth charges. In that moment, Dealey realized the Hunter was vulnerable. It was a radical idea, one that contradicted everything submarine captains were taught. The conventional wisdom was simple: when a destroyer attacks, dive deep and run. Use the submarine's ability to hide beneath the waves, play defense. But what if, Dealey wondered, you didn't run? What if, instead of diving, you turned your bow toward the charging destroyer and fired torpedoes straight at it? The Japanese captain would be so focused on the attack that he wouldn't be able to evade. The torpedoes would race toward the destroyer, while the destroyer raced toward the submarine. At the moment of detonation, the destroyer would be at point-blank range. It was insane. It was suicidal. And Dealey knew, deep in his bones, that it would work. He called it the down-the-throat shot. Over the next year, Dealey honed his skills. The Harder's second patrol, in August 1943, was far more successful. 5 confirmed ships sunk. Her third patrol, in October, added more victories to the tally. By early 1944, Dealey and the Harder had established themselves as one of the most effective submarine teams in the Pacific Fleet. But the true test was yet to come. In April 1944, the Harder was assigned to lifeguard duty near the Caroline Islands, rescuing American pilots shot down during air raids. On April 1st, Dealey received word that an injured pilot was stranded on the beach of a small Japanese-held island. The rescue seemed impossible. The island was crawling with enemy soldiers. Japanese snipers had already fired on previous rescue attempts. Any boat that approached the beach would be an easy target. Dealey didn't hesitate. He drove the Harder toward the reef surrounding the island, pushing the submarine's bow against the coral until it ground to a halt. With both propellers churning to hold the boat in position, he sent a rubber raft through the surf toward the beach. Japanese bullets whizzed overhead. The water around the raft erupted with splashes. But the Harder's crew kept paddling, reached the shore, grabbed the wounded pilot, Ensign John Galvin, and hauled him back to the submarine. It was the kind of rescue that seemed plucked from a Hollywood script, but for Dealey, it was just another day. And then came the moment that would define his legacy. April 13th, 1944. The Harder was patrolling north of the Western Caroline Islands when her radar detected an approaching contact. Within minutes, the silhouette materialized on the horizon. It was a Japanese destroyer, the Ikazuchi, 1,500 tons of steel and firepower closing fast. The men in the control room looked at each other nervously. They all knew what conventional wisdom demanded. Dive deep, run, escape. But Dealey had other plans. All ahead standard, he ordered calmly. Come to course 090. We're going to give him a present. The Harder turned toward the destroyer. In the torpedo room, sailors frantically loaded 4 Mark 14 torpedoes into the forward tubes. The range closed rapidly, 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. At 900 yards, less than half a mile, Dealey gave the order. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. 4 torpedoes streaked through the water toward the charging destroyer. For 55 seconds, nothing happened, and then the ocean erupted. The Ikazuchi took 2 direct hits and broke apart almost instantly. Within 5 minutes, she had vanished beneath the waves, taking most of her crew with her. Dealey's patrol report, submitted later, became legendary for its brevity and dark humor. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 Jap destroyer. The report was passed around ComSubAc headquarters with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. No one had ever written a patrol report quite like it. The casual tone, the dark mathematics of the equation, 4 torpedoes spent, 1 enemy warship destroyed, captured something essential about Dealey's character. He didn't boast, he didn't dramatize, he simply stated the facts and moved on. But behind the laconic prose was a tactical revolution. Dealey had proved that the down-the-throat shot wasn't just theoretically possible. It was devastatingly effective. The Ikazuchi had been one of Japan's most experienced anti-submarine vessels, her captain a veteran of dozens of depth-charge attacks, and Dealey had killed her in less than a minute. Word spread through the submarine fleet like wildfire. The quiet commander from Texas had done the impossible. He had turned the hunter into the hunted, and if he could do it once, he could do it again. But that was just the beginning. What happened over the next 2 months would cement Dealey's reputation as the most audacious submarine commander of the entire war. In late May 1944, Dealey received new orders. The Harder was to proceed to Tawitawi, a small island in the southern Philippines, where the Imperial Japanese Navy had established a major fleet anchorage. Intelligence indicated that a massive Japanese fleet, battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, was gathering there, preparing for a decisive engagement against American forces. Dealey's mission was reconnaissance. He was to observe the fleet, report its movements, and avoid detection at all costs. But there was a secondary objective, one that made the assignment far more dangerous. En route to Tawitawi, Dealey was to pick up a group of Australian commandos who had been operating behind enemy lines on the coast of Borneo. The guerrilla fighters had intelligence vital to Allied operations, and they needed extraction. The mission required the Harder to transit the Suicidal Passage, a narrow, heavily patrolled strait between Borneo and the Philippines. Japanese destroyers prowled those waters constantly, hunting for exactly the kind of submarine Dealey was commanding. It was, in short, a suicide mission. And Dealey accepted it without hesitation. On May 26, 1944, the Harder departed Fremantle, Australia, accompanied by another submarine, the USS Redfin. The 2 boats sailed north through the Celebes Sea, the tropical heat making the interior of the submarines almost unbearable. Men slept in shifts, sweating through their bunks, dreaming of home. On June 6th, the same day Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy half a world away, the Harder entered the Suicidal Passage. Night had fallen, but the moon was bright, flooding the passage with silver light. It was the worst possible conditions for a submarine. Any surface vessel would be able to spot the Harder from miles away. And then, at 9:30 p.m., the radar operator's voice cut through the humidity. Contact bearing 045, range 12,000 yards, multiple contacts, looks like a convoy. Dealey climbed to the bridge and raised his binoculars. 3 tankers, escorted by 2 destroyers. The ships were headed toward Tawitawi, probably carrying fuel for the Japanese fleet. The smart play was obvious. Shadow the convoy, report its position. Let the Harder's sister submarines handle the attack later. But Dealey wasn't interested in the smart play. Battle stations, he ordered. We're taking them. The Harder surged forward, cutting through the moonlit water toward the convoy. For 20 minutes, Dealey maneuvered his submarine into position, trying to find an angle of attack that wouldn't expose him to the destroyers. He never got the chance. At 9:59 p.m., the lead destroyer spotted the Harder. The Japanese captain must have been incredulous. What kind of fool would surface attack a convoy protected by 2 destroyers? But he didn't hesitate. He turned toward the submarine and accelerated, white foam cascading from his bow. In the Harder's control room, panic rippled through the crew. Everyone knew what was supposed to happen next. Dive, run, escape. It was the first rule of submarine warfare, drilled into every sailor from his first day of training. But Dealey wasn't diving. "All ahead flank," he ordered. "Come to course 350. We're going down his throat." Lieutenant Commander Lynch, the executive officer, grabbed Dealey's arm. "Captain, that's insane. We can't fight a destroyer on the surface." Dealey gently removed Lynch's hand. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "We're not going to fight him, Frank. We're going to kill him." The Harder turned toward the charging destroyer. The range closed with terrifying speed. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,200, 1,100. At 1,100 yards, less than 2/3 of a mile, Dealey gave the order. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. 3 torpedoes erupted from the Harder's stern tubes, streaking toward the oncoming destroyer. The Japanese captain saw them coming and threw his helm hard over, trying to evade. Too late. 2 torpedoes struck the Minazuki amidships. The explosion was so violent that it triggered the destroyer's own depth charges, which detonated in a secondary blast that ripped the ship apart. The Minazuki sank in 5 minutes. Of her crew of over 200 men, only 45 survived. Dealey didn't pause to celebrate. His radar was already showing the second destroyer turning toward the Harder, seeking revenge. "Reload all tubes," he ordered. "We've got another customer." For the next 2 hours, Dealey played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the surviving destroyer. He maneuvered, he dodged, he waited for the perfect shot. But the Japanese captain was good, better than the first one. He kept his distance, refusing to charge headlong into another down-the-throat trap. Eventually, Dealey was forced to disengage. The Harder slipped away into the darkness, leaving the shattered convoy behind. But the night's killing was far from over. The following evening, June 7th, the Harder crept toward the Borneo coastline to retrieve the Australian commandos. 6 men emerged from the jungle in rubber boats. Major William Jenkins, Lieutenant Woods, and 4 enlisted soldiers who had been living behind enemy lines for months. They looked gaunt and exhausted, but their eyes were sharp. Dealey brought them aboard, fed them, gave them bunks. And then he returned to the Suicidal Passage. He wasn't done hunting. On the night of June 8th, as the Harder transited the narrowest part of the passage, her radar detected 2 more contacts, enemy destroyers, patrolling the strait in search of submarines. They were positioned perfectly, covering both approaches to Tawitawi. Dealey's crew watched the radar returns with growing dread. The destroyers were less than 6 miles from the Japanese fleet anchorage. If the Harder attacked and missed, enemy reinforcements would arrive within minutes. There would be no escape. Lynch approached Dealey on the bridge. "Sir, we've got the commandos. We've got the intelligence. Our mission is complete. We can slip past these destroyers and head for home." Dealey considered the words for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Those destroyers are going to attack our boys," he said quietly. "When the fleet moves on our carriers, those destroyers are going to be hunting our submarines. Every destroyer we sink now is one less destroyer trying to kill our friends later." He paused, his jaw tight. "Load all forward tubes. We're going in." The Harder approached the destroyers from the east, using the darkness to mask her approach. The moon had set, and the passage was shrouded in shadow. At 1,000 yards, Dealey could see both destroyers overlapping in his periscope, one behind the other, their silhouettes merging into a single target. It was a once-in-a-lifetime shot. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. 4 torpedoes raced toward the Japanese ships. The second and third torpedoes struck the lead destroyer, the Tanakaze, with devastating force. Her boilers exploded in a massive eruption of steam and fire, and she sank almost instantly. The 4th torpedo hit the second destroyer, which Dealey believed was the Ikazuchi. The explosion was blinding, a column of flame that rose hundreds of feet into the air. Within minutes, both targets had vanished beneath the waves. Dealey surfaced to confirm the kills. Where 2 destroyers had been, only a burning oil slick remained. A single Japanese buoy, lit and bobbing in the wreckage, marked the spot where the second ship had gone down. 2 destroyers, 1 attack, less than 5 minutes. The Harder's crew erupted in cheers. They had just accomplished something unprecedented. Destroyed 2 enemy warships in a single engagement in waters crawling with Japanese forces within sight of the enemy fleet. But Dealey wasn't celebrating. He was already scanning the horizon, looking for the next target. "All ahead standard," he ordered. "Set course for Tawitawi. We're going to take a look at that fleet." What happened over the next 24 hours became the stuff of legend and helped change the course of the Pacific War. On June 10, 1944, the Harder approached the Tawitawi anchorage for reconnaissance. Through his periscope, Dealey observed something remarkable. The entire Japanese mobile fleet gathered in one place. 3 battleships, 4 cruisers, multiple aircraft carriers, dozens of destroyers. It was the largest concentration of enemy naval power he had ever seen. Dealey carefully noted the fleet's composition and position, preparing to transmit his findings to Admiral Raymond Spruance's forces. The intelligence would prove invaluable in the coming Battle of the Philippine Sea, the engagement that would effectively destroy Japanese naval aviation forever. But, as Dealey watched, a Japanese aircraft spotted the Harder's periscope. Within seconds, one of the screening destroyers peeled away from the fleet and began racing toward the submarine at 35 knots. The range closed with terrifying speed. This time, there was no darkness to hide in. This time, the destroyer knew exactly where the Harder was. This time, there would be no element of surprise. Dealey's men looked at each other with quiet resignation. They had pushed their luck too far. They had attacked 4 destroyers in 4 days, killed hundreds of enemy sailors, penetrated the most heavily defended waters in the Pacific. And now, finally, their luck had run out. But Samuel Dealey wasn't ready to die. "All ahead flank," he ordered. "Come to course 270. We're going down his throat one more time." The words hit the crew like a physical blow. Another down-the-throat shot? Against a destroyer that was already at battle stations? Against a captain who knew exactly what Dealey was capable of? It was madness, pure, unadulterated madness. And yet, as the Harder's bow swung toward the charging destroyer, something remarkable happened. The fear in the control room began to fade. It was replaced by something else, a fierce, desperate pride. They were the crew of the USS Harder. They had already done the impossible. Why not do it one more time? At 1,500 yards, Dealey fired 3 torpedoes directly at the oncoming destroyer. Then he ordered an immediate crash dive. "Take her down. All ahead emergency. Make your depth 400 feet." The Harder plunged toward the ocean floor, her hull groaning under the pressure. In the torpedo room, men braced themselves against bulkheads, waiting for the impact of depth charges. And then, 55 seconds after launch, they heard it. A massive explosion transmitted through the water with a force that shook the entire submarine. Then another explosion. Then silence. At 80 feet below the surface, the Harder passed directly beneath the spot where the destroyer had been. Debris rained down around them. Chunks of steel, fragments of hull plating, the detritus of a warship torn apart by her own prey. The destroyer was gone. Dealey had killed again. The Japanese Navy was in a state of shock. 5 destroyers sunk by a single submarine in 4 days. It was impossible. It had to be multiple submarines, a whole squadron of American boats surrounding Tawitawi, waiting to pick off any ship that ventured outside the anchorage. Admiral Sumu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, made a fateful decision. He ordered the mobile fleet to depart Tawitawi immediately, 1 day ahead of schedule. The anchorage was too dangerous. The Americans had somehow infiltrated the most secure waters in the Japanese Empire. What Toyota didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he was fleeing from a single man. The early departure threw the Japanese battle plans into chaos. When the mobile fleet finally engaged American forces in the Battle of the Philippine Sea 2 weeks later, they were disorganized, poorly coordinated, and critically short of the destroyers that Dealey had sent to the bottom. The result was a catastrophe for Japan. In what American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed. Over 600 aircraft were shot down. 3 aircraft carriers were sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered. The numbers tell only part of the story. Japan's carrier aviation, the force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, that had conquered an empire stretching from China to New Guinea, was broken in a single day. The pilots who died in the Turkey Shoot were irreplaceable. Japan's training programs had never recovered from the attrition of previous battles, and the flight schools simply couldn't produce skilled aviators fast enough. After June 19, 1944, Japan would never again be able to challenge American naval aviation on equal terms. And Samuel Dealey had helped make it happen. His attacks had depleted the destroyer screen that should have protected the Japanese carriers. His reconnaissance had provided American commanders with crucial intelligence about enemy dispositions. His very presence off Tawitawi had spooked Admiral Toyota into a premature departure that disrupted Japanese planning and left their forces poorly positioned for the coming engagement. Not bad for a man who had flunked out of Annapolis. Military historians have debated for decades how much credit Samuel Dealey deserves for the American victory in the Philippine Sea. Some argue that his attacks on the destroyers, while impressive, were tactically insignificant. Others claim that his reconnaissance of Tawitawi and the premature departure of the Japanese fleet fundamentally altered the course of the battle. What is undeniable is that Dealey returned to Australia as a hero. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. the nation's highest military decoration, for his actions during the 5th Patrol. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented him with the Army Distinguished Service Cross. His crew received a Presidential Unit Citation, only the second ever awarded to a submarine. The newspapers called him the Destroyer Killer. His patrol report, with its laconic descriptions of impossibly dangerous attacks, was passed from hand to hand throughout the submarine fleet. Young officers studied his tactics, tried to understand how he had accomplished the unthinkable. But perhaps the most telling tribute came from Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of all Pacific Fleet submarines. After the war, Lockwood wrote about Dealey in glowing terms. When a natural leader and born daredevil such as Mush Morton is given command of a submarine, Lockwood observed, referencing another legendary commander, the result can only be a fighting ship of the highest order, with officers and men who would follow their skipper to the gates of hell. He paused, then added, and they did. But for Samuel Dealey, the gates of hell were closer than anyone knew. The Harder departed Fremantle on August 5th, 1944, for her 6th and final patrol. She was accompanied by 2 other submarines, the USS Haddo and the USS Hake, operating as a wolf pack under Dealey's command. By this point, Dealey was showing unmistakable signs of strain. The constant stress of combat, the weight of responsibility for 78 lives, the accumulated exhaustion of 6 war patrols, it was taking its toll. His executive officer, Frank Lynch, later recalled finding Dealey in a state of mild shock, unable to make a decision during moments of crisis. But Dealey refused to be relieved of command. There was still a war to fight. There were still enemy ships to sink. And so, on that August morning, the Harder sailed north toward the Philippines one last time. The patrol began successfully. On August 21st, the Wolfpack attacked a Japanese convoy near Mindoro Island, sinking 4 enemy merchantmen. Dealey didn't score any kills himself, but he coordinated the attack with his usual brilliance, directing the other submarines into optimal firing positions. 2 days later, on August 23rd, the submarine USS Haddo sank a Japanese destroyer called the Asakaze near Cape Bolinao. Dealey believed the destroyer had been crippled and towed into nearby Dassel Bay, and he moved the Harder into position to finish her off. It was a fatal miscalculation. On the morning of August 24th, 1944, the USS Hawk was patrolling outside Dassel Bay when her sonar operator detected 2 contacts emerging from the harbor. One was a patrol boat, a converted American destroyer that the Japanese had captured at the beginning of the war. The other was a brand new coastal defense vessel, the CD-22, bristling with the latest anti-submarine equipment. The Hake's captain, Commander Frank Haler, maneuvered to attack, but as he approached, his lookouts spotted something alarming. 600 yards dead ahead, the periscope of the USS Harder was breaking the surface. Dealey was setting up for another down-the-throat shot. The CD-22 was heading straight toward him, just like all the destroyers before. He would wait until the last possible moment, fire his torpedoes, and add another kill to his legendary record. But this time, something went wrong. At 7:28 a.m., Commander Haler heard 15 rapid explosions echoing through the water. Depth charges. The sound was coming from the direction of the Harder. He waited, listening, hoping to hear the familiar sound of the Harder's propellers, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a submarine making its escape. He heard nothing. The USS Harder had vanished. For hours, the Heike searched the area, desperately hoping to find some sign of her sister ship. A debris field, an oil slick, survivors in the water, anything. There was nothing. Samuel Dealey and his entire crew of 79 men were gone. The Navy never determined exactly what happened in those final minutes. The most likely explanation is that Dealey's torpedoes missed, the first time he had ever failed to score a hit during a down-the-throat attack. Without the explosion to cover his escape, the Harder was vulnerable. The CD-22's depth charges found their mark. But there's another possibility, one that haunted the submarine fleet for years afterward. Perhaps Dealey had simply pushed his luck too far. Perhaps, after killing 5 destroyers in 4 days, he had begun to believe he was invincible. Perhaps, in that final moment, he had forgotten the fundamental rule of survival. Even the best eventually run out of luck. The news of the Harder's loss sent shockwaves through the American submarine force. How could this have happened? How could the destroyer killer, the man who had sunk more enemy warships than any other submarine captain, be dead? Admiral Lockwood was devastated. He had lost more than a subordinate. He had lost a friend, a protege, a man he had called one of the greatest submarine skippers of all time. In his official report, Lockwood wrote simply, Harder was lost with all hands on or about 24 August 1944, presumably as a result of enemy action in the vicinity of Dassel Bay, Philippine Islands. The words were dry, bureaucratic. They didn't capture the magnitude of the loss. Samuel Dealey was 37 years old when he died. He left behind a wife, Edwina, and their children. He never saw the end of the war he had given his life to win. In all, Dealey was credited with sinking 16 enemy ships, totaling over 54,000 tons, enough to rank him among the top 5 submarine aces of World War II. More remarkably, he sank at least 4 destroyers, the only American submarine commander to achieve such a distinction. Post-war analysis suggested the number might actually be higher, but Japanese records were too fragmentary to confirm. But statistics don't capture the true measure of Samuel Dealey's legacy. What made him remarkable wasn't the tonnage he sank or the medals he received. It was the way he fought. At a time when submarine captains were trained to avoid combat, Dealey sought it out. At a time when the conventional wisdom demanded caution and restraint, Dealey attacked with reckless audacity. At a time when destroyers were considered the natural predators of submarines, Dealey made them his prey. He proved that courage, raw, unyielding, almost suicidal courage, could change the mathematics of war. One man, one submarine, could alter the course of history. Consider the impact of his actions. Before Dealey developed the down-the-throat tactic, American submarines avoided destroyers at all costs. The standard doctrine was clear. Destroyers were hunters, submarines were prey. When you saw a destroyer, you ran. Dealey flipped that equation on its head. He showed that a submarine, properly handled by a skilled commander, could take the fight directly to the enemy's most dangerous surface combatants. His success didn't just sink ships, it changed minds. Other submarine captains began to realize that they weren't as helpless against destroyers as they had believed. In the months after Dealey's 5th Patrol, reports began filtering back to COMSOPAC headquarters of other submarines attempting down-the-throat attacks. Not all of them succeeded. It remained an incredibly dangerous maneuver, but the psychological shift was profound. American submarine captains were no longer simply thinking about survival, they were thinking about victory. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, was reeling. Before Dealey's attacks around Tawitawi, Japanese destroyer captains had approached anti-submarine warfare with confident aggression. They knew the mathematics favored them. A destroyer had speed, depth charges, sonar, deck guns. A submarine had stealth and torpedoes, but once detected, it was helpless. After Dealey, everything changed. Japanese destroyer captains became hesitant, uncertain. They had seen what happened to ships that charged directly at American submarines. They had heard the rumors, the stories of the ghost boat that hunted their kind, the submarine that turned predator into prey. This psychological warfare was perhaps Dealey's greatest legacy. War isn't just about ships and shells. It's about will, about confidence, about the conviction that you can win. Dealey damaged the Japanese Navy's confidence in ways that tonnage figures could never capture. The United States Navy named a destroyer escort in his honor, the USS Dealey, commissioned in 1954. His name is inscribed on the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery, alongside thousands of other Americans who died in the Pacific and have no known grave. In 2024, 80 years after Dealey's death, a deep-sea exploration team finally located the wreck of the USS Harder. She lies 3,000 feet beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, sitting upright on the ocean floor. Depth charge damages visible near the conning tower, silent testimony to those final desperate moments on August 24, 1944. The discovery brought closure to the families of the 79 men who went down with the Harder. It also sparked renewed interest in the story of Samuel Dealey, a story that had faded from public memory over the decades. For generations, the families of Harder's crew had lived with uncertainty. They knew their fathers, grandfathers, brothers, and uncles were gone, but they didn't know where or exactly how. The ocean had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only memories and questions. When the Lost 52 Project announced the discovery, the reactions were overwhelming. Descendants traveled from across the country to attend memorial services. They brought photographs, letters, medals, the artifacts of lives cut short by war. Some wept, others stood in silence, finally able to say goodbye to men they had never known, men who had died before they were born. The wreck itself tells a story. The Harder sits upright on the seafloor, her hull largely intact despite 8 decades in the depths. The depth charge damage is concentrated near the stern, evidence that the fatal attack came from behind, that Dealey was probably trying to escape when the explosions found him. But there's also something else visible in the footage. The forward torpedo tubes still pointed toward the enemy. Even in death, even after the depth charges began to fall, the Harder was facing her foe. She went down fighting just as her captain would have wanted. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Dealey came from one of his own crew members, a sailor who had served with him on multiple patrols. Years after the war, the man was asked what it was like to serve under the destroyer killer. He thought for a moment, remembering the terror of those down-the-throat attacks, the sleepless nights, the constant proximity of death. Then he smiled. The captain had a saying, the sailor recalled. He used to tell us, hit 'em harder. That was the motto of the boat. Hit 'em harder. He paused, his eyes distant. And by God, we did. The story of Samuel Dealey is, at its core, a story about the nature of courage. Not the reckless bravado of a man who doesn't understand danger, but the calculated defiance of someone who understands it perfectly and chooses to act anyway. Dealey knew the risks of the down-the-throat attack better than anyone. He had calculated the angles, studied the physics, understood exactly how slim his margin for error was. He knew that one missed torpedo, one malfunction, one moment of bad luck, could mean the death of himself and every man aboard his submarine. And yet he attacked again and again because he believed that the reward was worth the risk. Every destroyer he sank was a destroyer that couldn't hunt other American submarines. Every convoy he disrupted was fuel and supplies that wouldn't reach Japanese forces. Every moment of chaos he created among enemy commanders was an opportunity for his own side to seize the initiative. In the end, Samuel Dealey's luck ran out. The down-the-throat attack that had worked so perfectly 5 times failed on the 6th. Whether it was a technical malfunction, operator error, or simply the inexorable mathematics of probability finally catching up with him, we will never know. But here's what we do know. In the weeks after Dealey's death, the tide of the Pacific War turned decisively in favor of the United States. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had crippled Japanese naval aviation. American forces were island-hopping toward the Japanese mainland. The end, while still distant, was finally visible on the horizon. Samuel Dealey didn't live to see that victory, but he helped make it possible. 79 men followed him into the depths of the Philippine Sea. They followed him because they believed in him, trusted him, knew that if anyone could lead them through impossible odds, it was the soft-spoken Texan who had already done the impossible so many times before. They were the crew of the USS Harder. They lived by a simple creed. Hit 'em harder. And they did. Every single day. Until the very end. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. These forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us tell their stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about real courage, and leave a comment telling us which World War II story you'd like us to cover next. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about people. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their country needed them most. Samuel Dealey was one of those people. And now, thanks to you, his story will never be forgotten.